Hey everybody. So today we're going to go and explore a different angle from what we had last time. So hope you all are doing well. We're going to go a little bit more into what social control looks like, and so far as the other end of things. So last time we were asking, why do we do what we do? Why do we do what we do? And today we're going to ask the opposite end of that. We're going to say, why don't we do what we do? So one of the big questions we asked as far as social structures go, this first part, is why do what we do what we do? Why do what we do what we do? And we're talking about social control and how systems influence us. So we talk about how we could be directly influenced by things both overtly, so through things like prison systems, policing systems, but also indirectly, so the power of symbols and different things of control. So one of the things of why do what we do why we do what we do. This idea of overt and covert control. We talked a bit about the idea of the Milgram experiments, the Stanford prison experiments, and how strong this symbol is. So being controlled by the power of this symbol in the case of the Stanford prison experiment was ideas of the police uniform, the guard uniform, and the prisoner uniform, or in the Milgram experiment, the power of a person in a lab coat, what that means for us as far as following forms of authority. So the questions we had at the end of all that is, are we free? Is there hope? Do we have agency? So a big question we are left with then is, how free are we to make our own decisions? So we're going to kind of go explore that a little bit more deeply as far as looking at people that don't do what they're supposed to do. So why are people deviating from norms? So in society and in sociology, if we're looking at the power of social structures, what causes that power to be transgressed or causes people not to follow what they're supposed to? So one of the main ideas we're going to look at this term of deviance. So people that deviate from what they're supposed to do. Look at that in a little bit. And finding hope that in deviance and how this could be a possible framework for us to think about how things change. One of these, an example we could take a look at as far as the Bonneau gang or the Bonnet gang. It's a French group, early 1900s. Is They organized and they were deviants from society. And for some, they're called illegalists. So to some folks, these people were considered criminals. To others, they were considered revolutionaries. So essentially, what they did is their argument as illegalists, this movement sweeping Europe at the time, was the idea that if laws, regulations, and social structures, if the economy and jobs, if they're not going to support us, then why should we follow them? So a lot of what the Bonneau gang members did is that says if these laws aren't going to support us, if we're not going to be able to get good jobs, then we're not going to follow these laws. So essentially, they call themselves legalists. And as some frameworks, they'd actually say that these illegal activities were a way to actually change society. There's a picture depicted here, and if you look them up, we'll have more information on them. But essentially, some of the things they would do, for instance, they were sort of like a Robin Hood, a fabled Robin Hood in the time that they would rob banks, they would steal artwork, they would take cars. And a lot of this stuff was, not all of them, but some of them would focus only on taking it from the wealthy or the rich. So in some cases, one of the popular stories is they stole a car, and at the time, this was before cars were widely available. So only the very wealthy had cars. So essentially, you'd go around in a car and use that as their getaway vehicle. So they were um, challenging social norms while at the same time engaging in activities that were considered illegal. So as far as we start thinking about this, then how does this give us hope as far as things changing, society changing? Can we look at the idea of deviating from social norms to change things? A little bit further down then. So deviance, of course, then. So deviance simply, this is the main term we'll be looking at, is behavior that avoids the standards of conduct, both formal and informal. So a person can be a deviant if they don't follow the laws, for instance, like the illegalists did. So if you don't follow law, you might be considered a criminal. The idea is you deviate from things that are supposed to regulate you. Or they don't follow the norms. So these norms are normal ideas of behavior. We think of those as far as being polite in society, acting certain ways, doing certain things. These are unwritten laws. So if we think about both of these, we could think of them back in the very beginning. We talked about overt versus covert control. So overt control were things like laws, regulations, policies. Covert control might be, for instance, if we're looking at schooling, go up a little bit here, talk about school. So in the framework of school, overt things might be teachers' rules in the classroom, so class rules. Whereas covert ones, less obvious ones might be things like don't speak unless spoken to, respect your elders, adults, things that are not legally enforceable, but things you might maybe get in trouble for if you don't follow these rules. So deviance can be either one of these things. So if we look back at each of our theoretical perspectives, we talked about functionalism, conflict theory, and interactionism. Each of these different frameworks has a different view on what deviance could be, different view on what role deviance plays in society. So one of the we're going to take a look at each of these three and see what they have to say about deviance and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And at the very end, we're going to go back and look to see how these things might apply, how I might actually apply these to real life. So functionalism. Let's start off with the first one. So part of a review, remember from our first or second week, the idea that they're almost looking for a formula that makes society function. We had that brilliant artwork of it looking sort of like a human body. If you imagine a human body and all of society, they like to use the image of the body where there's the head, the hand and foot. And each one of these parts, like the worker, the teacher, the principal, all make up society. They all work in the body as a whole. So in a sense then, functionalism is taking a look at how we might look at these roles and how this shapes society. So given that, then, when we're talking about deviance from this perspective, deviance in functionalism, they view it as helping define or limit behavior or produce order in society. So deviance from a functionalist perspective helps define or limit behavior to produce order. So basically saying that if something is not working in society, if something is disordered, then it's bad. So functionalists tend to see things that deviating from the norm is something not working correctly, we gotta fix it. So we might, using the body metaphor, you might think deviance might be something like somebody's sick. If somebody has the flu, that's sort of like a deviance that the system is not working properly. So you'd want to be able to fix it, right? So there's two different ways that functionalists apply this to help us get through and understand this a little bit better. And so one of them is this anomie. So it's a French word of feeling alone, feeling separated from people. So in eras of change, this feeling of normlessness or times of profound change. So basically then, it's Durkheim, again, we talked Durkheim the first week. When people do not feel connected to each other, when you're feeling lonely or disconnected, and he's talking about at a social level, it's this feeling of anomie. So if we look back, if we think of society as a whole, and basic anomie is when you, the individual, do not feel connected to that. So a good, healthy society is when everyone's inside of the society, if each of these are individuals, and this is good. So if we have people on the outside of that feeling alienated, that's bad. Or in a situation of anomie, or it's a way to describe deviance when people are feeling separated from others. Okay? So way to also look at this then, a second way that we look at this is adaptation. So when people are feeling separated, alienated from society. There's a way to try to feel reconciled, to try to feel like you fit in again. So in our example here, if this is society and this is the individual, if you want to feel connected again, how might you do that? How might you start repeating, reconnect to society? Right here. So what Merton suggests that basically it's when people feel disconnected, they do what they can to reconnect. So we have a chart here that kind of explains this. So in this section over here, the adaption, it's what people might do in order to feel like they're reconnected again. So for an example, this first one is the easiest, conformity. It's when people have the same means, same social actions as society defines, and also the same goals. So for instance, you might think of a college student. It might be someone who conforms. So a college student, CS for college student, is an example of conformity because they have the same goals in society. Let's say social goals would be to own a house and make money, make lots of money. The means they do that is also legal, is also part of the norm. So a college student goes to school, then you go get a job. So this is conformity. By going to school and getting that job, this equals money, for instance. Okay, so that's conforming to the same means or social actions with the same goal of making money. Right? So another version of this then, we could use it to compare is innovation. So if someone has different means, different actions, but the same goal as society. So for instance, we might think of somebody like a criminal, for someone engaging in criminal behavior. So maybe you engage in crime in order to make that money. So this, engaging in crime, is not the same. Well, the goal is the same. So your goal, social goal is the same. You want to make money, but your way of getting there is not the same. You're breaking norms. You're deviating. So I'm going to go through each one of these similar ideas. So you can see that these all separated based on actions and goals. So ritualism is maybe somebody who has the same actions but different goals, or maybe they don't have any goals. So ritualism might be somebody who maybe goes to school as a business major just because that's what their parents told them to do. So they go through the actions, but they don't necessarily know what they want to do with their lives. Maybe they go through the actions of being in business school, but in the end they want to be an actor or be an artist. So their goals are different. They don't necessarily care about the money, but they go through the same actions. Another one might be something like retreatism. And maybe think of that classic example of somebody who just is tired of it all. Different actions, different goals. Maybe they go live up in the mountains in a cabin. Go live out in the desert in a cabin, away from everybody. So they have different actions and different goals. And the last one here, rebellion. Merton describes this idea of you don't agree with anything in society. You would do different actions and different goals. So maybe your goal over here isn't money at all. You want a society that doesn't have money, and you don't care about schooling and stuff. To get there, everyone should have a chance. So everyone has what they need. So different actions, different goals. New society. So essentially, what they're both looking at, Durkheim and Merton, is they're all kind of coming back to this same picture over here of a person trying to become a part of society. And if you're feeling separated, how can we fix that? The spot right here where you try to fix that. And how you make sense of your world, it's the connection between individual and society. So that's functionalism. Essentially, anything that deviates from it is something that needs to be fixed or addressed. It's something in society that's not working, and things could work better if people were willing to rethink things or maybe readjust how they do things, but they have maybe a way to make themselves as individuals connecting with the goals. Okay? So the second one we want to take a look at then is conflict theory, how it applies here. This is number 2. So This one of ways we mentioned before to review conflict theory from the first to second week. So again, the two main things you always want to remember with conflict theory is relationships and power. So basically, the relationship between two groups. In this case, we looked at ruling class and working class, looking at how their conflicts might be different, their interests might be different, and how that's going to result in different societies. So for instance, when we talked about boss versus worker, a boss wants to make have people make lower wages, because the lower wages are, or the lower they pay their employees, the more money they themselves can have. Whereas a worker wants higher wages because they need to go back home and pay for their rent, right? So this idea of lower wages versus higher wages, it's a conflict in power. So that's what it involves in change. So looking here, we're looking at the relationship, there's that word, relationship, of power between ruling class, or the boss, working class, the worker, and seeing how that changes society. So from this perspective then, because we take power seriously in this perspective, they want to take a look at how they think deviance isn't necessarily something that just exists as something that's like a moral or ethical idea, but it's something that helps keep those in power. So preserve the power of those stronger into the relationship. So if we're looking at this example here, in conflict theory, we wouldn't think so much that rule is there, legal or otherwise, but it's not just there because it's an ethical thing, but because the boss themselves thinks it might be able to make their lives better. The ruling person wants to be able to make their lives easier and be able to keep their power. So if you take this idea further, the idea that is policing, law enforcement, religious rules, moral norms, these are all used to back up the powerful people in society. Right? So an example I'd like to give for this is if we look back in the 1920s, during the era of prohibition, when alcohol was made illegal in the United States, the idea popularly is that alcohol was made illegal because it was an immoral thing. That people were getting too drunk, and we didn't want to have that in our society anymore. An alternative view, a conflict theorist would look at this as a way of kind of like between the boss and the worker, and saying that the reason alcohol was made illegal was more about preserving the boss's power, because when workers went to places like a pub or a bar, this is where unions would happen. People get together and complain about their bosses, and they become stronger and maybe try to challenge the authority of their bosses. So the idea then, something like prohibition then, would be able to make alcohol illegal and thereby prevent unions from happening. So this would be an example of how a conflict theorist would look at the power relationship between two groups of people and see how deviance wasn't something necessarily that was for the best of everybody, but specifically for the preservation of power. Okay. Finally, when we look at the third perspective, the interactionism or interactionist theory, this again is when we're looking at this idea. So if we thought of the first two, conflict theory and functionalism, as being something that looks from society down to the individual, this one's actually looking from the individuals and their relationship together, how they interact with each other, how this creates society. So in one perspective, society creates the individual, and from this perspective, the individual creates society. So what does deviance look like from this perspective? So as we mentioned before, how individuals interact with each other, they create symbols. These symbols create meaning and literally create society and reality. Okay? So deviance in this perspective then isn't so much as what society says it is, but deviance is created by the interaction between two people. And so what is deviant is also what two people reinforce. So if you were to call your friend out about something, or to laugh at your friend and make fun of somebody, this idea is a way of controlling what deviant behavior is, because people want to avoid being shamed or judged by their peers. So, a popular perspective that comes out of this then is this idea of labeling theory. So, not necessarily why are people deviant. Interactionists aren't necessarily concerned with that as much as how being labeled deviant affects people. So the example I like to give with this one is maybe a good student versus a bad student. So if a teacher were to come in on the first day of school and talk about one person, oh, you're the best student I ever had, you're a good student, nothing but great things are going to happen for you, versus another student, they go look to them and they say, you're a bad student, everything you do is going to work in failure, and nothing's going to work out for you. This idea then, if you have somebody in authority telling you that you're good or telling you that you're bad, this label, the label itself, can then become something that actually makes reality happen. And we saw this maybe with the Stanford prison experiment or the Milgram experiment. What happens when somebody, an authority says something, labels somebody something, is actually could change reality for that person. So deviance from interactionist perspective isn't necessarily so much on how something is, well, whose power it's serving or why it's made illegal or what it functions in society, but what ends up happening when you take the symbol of something being labeled as bad and what effects might this have on somebody? Can this affect somebody in the real world? Okay? So the way we're going to connect all these things together, the three versions of functionalism, conflict theory, and interactionist, is applying it directly to something that's considered deviant behavior. So the way we look at this then, when we're thinking about this, is taking a look at things being made illegal. So generally to this idea of actual debate on the legalization of marijuana. So for instance, if we ask the question, should marijuana be made legal? Should it be legalized? So each of these three theories would have a different thing to say about that. So what I want us to do then is to go ahead and make an argument from at least two of these theories. So if you were to try to make the argument for functionalism, for instance, you might want to talk about how making something illegal is good for society because it preserves order, right? Or something from conflict theory, how might you look at the power relationship? Whose interest is it? How is power preserved if something were made illegal? So that making something illegal, how does that preserve power and keep things the way they are? Or the interactionist perspective, the final one, this idea of labeling somebody a deviant or labeling somebody a criminal, what does that do to them? So consider then these three theoretical frames we talked about, not only their basic theory, so the basic theory of functionalism, the basic things that we reviewed about conflict theory, the basic things we reviewed about interactionist perspective, but also what each of them thinks about deviance. So from a theoretical perspective, argue for or against, not necessarily your perspective, but what you think a person from that theoretical perspective would say. So would someone from that perspective, functionalism, conflict theory, or interactionism, would they think that legalization is good? Would they think it's bad? From that perspective, is deviance a good thing or is it a bad thing? How might this shape how they feel about legalization, right? So really just feel free to have fun with this one as far as trying to think about what your opponent might say and how you can make the best argument to argue for why or why not something should be made legal or be maintained as illegal.